Scar can even get trapped in these things? Oh my god. Those little things that trap you in the floor? Yeah, trap Scar. Didn't know that. Just found out. Wow. That's pretty bad. That's really, really bad actually. You have once again proven that you've earned your nickname, Scara. Hey everyone, Shark here, and I'm bringing you a video that is a lot spicier than my normal ones. But I felt I had to make it, since tons of people continue to come to my Twitch chat very bright-eyed and filled with excited anticipation for Wanderer. Sadly, I think many of them will be disappointed because I was super excited for Wanderer's release ever since his introduction where he tells us the sky is fake and then vanishes for 2 years. Sadly, he really let me down. And I just want people to know his limitations so they don't feel the same regret. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot about him that's really appealing. The visual and sound effects of his attacks are super satisfying.
You won't be there to see it!
Making him feel super powerful and fast. And his floating mechanic makes him really unique and feels as if he's got a huge advantage while fighting enemies. But this is ironically part of the problem. Wanderer's animations, effects, sound design, and playstyle are so clean and appealing that they easily mask the real problems he has. I'll put it like this. Getting Wanderer is like getting a letter saying your long-lost uncle left you a gorgeous mansion that looks just like the one Tony Stark has. But after you move in, you realize the entire foundation is made of discarded ramen cups. No matter how impressive it looks, the core that it's built on has some serious issues. And that is truly a shame because Wanderer is the most invested character I have. He's level 90 with a Skyward Atlas, he's triple crowned, and he has some of the best artifacts I own. I was also incredibly lucky when pulling for him and got 2 copies in one 10 pull, so he's also Constellation 1, which is not something I can say for my other 5 stars. But after heavily investing into him, his damage still seems a little lackluster and he still has a whole host of issues that better gear won't fix. That's why I'm first going to cover his gameplay problems, and at the end of the video, I'll show you evidence on how Hoyo is literally scamming people by misrepresenting Wanderer's capabilities. So let's go over why I regret Wanderer and why I named him what I did. Wanderer's damage is okay on its own, but other teams can do way more damage with less investment. Pairing him with a really good offensive support like Bennett will significantly increase his damage, but characters like Bennett are often much better used on other teams that are already stronger than most Wanderer teams. And while you can use characters like Layla or Toma for shielding, Wanderer won't make up for the loss in damage from not using a more offensive support. His damage just seems really nerfed without Faruzan, and Faruzan is honestly just a terribly designed character that is basically a wasted party slot until she's Constellation 6. Remember how Wanderer is like Tony Stark's mansion built on a foundation of rotting ramen cups? Well, Faruzan is like if you tried to fix those structural problems by shoveling in bricks of uncooked ramen into that foundation. You could argue that it fixes the issue of the ramen cups not having any ramen, but that's not really the core issue at hand. Faruzan can enhance Wanderer's offensive capabilities, but he still needs to be hyper invested into to do any real damage. And even then, the problem is that she doesn't shore up any of his core problems. She just effectively distracts from his other issues by making you do bigger numbers. So Hypercarry Wanderer ends up being pretty bad unless you are super invested into him and spend a massive amount of resin and primo gems on his teams. But he's an Anemo character and he can fly, so he'd probably make a good on-field swirl carry, right? After all, his Ascension 1 passive grants him bonuses when his skill comes into contact with Pyro, Cryo, Electro, and Hydro, which on the surface seems like it would be great for damage, utility, and team versatility. But in reality, this passive often gets ignored because it's usually worse to run Wanderer as an Anemo driver instead of a character like Sucrose or Kazuha for the same reason that no one runs Zhao as an Anemo swirl driver. Because even though Wanderer is an Anemo character and the Anemo element is really strong, don't think he's designed to reap the benefits. Anemo is a really strong element because of the swirl reaction. But you don't really want to build Wanderer for Swirl when you could do the same thing with a character like Sucrose and have it be much better just because of how Sucrose works. This is also the reason why people don't build Wanderer for elemental reaction damage. Instead, they just build him like a normal DPS with attack and crit. So really, he's not like a typical Animo character that wants to swirl. Just think of him more like a green physical DPS character. Wanderer's damage issues are actually his easiest problems to fix. All you have to do is just use lots and lots of primos to get some really good supports and a good weapon for him, and then use lots and lots of resin to get some really good artifacts, and he'll be doing plenty of damage. However, none of that matters if he cannot hit his targets, which is another one of his issues. Wanderer's attacks have a very long range, but it doesn't matter because his attacks auto-targeting is really bad.
Aimlessness is not his game.
This poor auto-targeting causes him to sometimes aim in a completely different direction from your intended target. And this effect becomes more pronounced the further away the target is. So, even though Wanderer has one of the longest ranges of any Catalyst character, his range won't matter if he doesn't even aim at the enemy. The other problem with Wanderer's range is that it can be really hard to hit enemies below you. Even a gentle slope can be enough to throw off the delicate sensitivity that is Wanderer's attacks, meaning that even if enemies are close, his attacks can miss if Wanderer is slightly too high above them. This is a problem you'll encounter mostly in the overworld where the terrain is uneven, but this is also a problem on completely flat ground like domains and the Abyss. Even on completely even ground, if you ascend Wanderer slightly to avoid attacks, you might not be able to hit enemies. And what good is ascending to avoid enemy attacks if it causes you to miss your own? So what, we can't play Wanderer at really long range, and we can't ascend above enemies because his auto-targeting is really bad, and it might be impossible to hit those enemies. Cool, we'll just play him at a closer range. Except that there is a really big problem with that. Wanderer has no resistance to interruption, which is not uncommon, but when he gets hit, it is much worse than getting hit while on another character. When you get hit while in the air, there is a much longer special animation where you have to fall all the way down and then float back up in the air again, and you will have to experience this over and over and over again. I can't count the number of times I've been spamming buttons trying to do some sort of tech fall to recover early from a knockdown, but you can't. You just have to fall all the way down and then float back up again, and if you get hit again, you have to fall all the way back down again and then float up again and again and again and again. And of course you may say, haha, get good and just don't get hit, lol. Here's the problem though. You could get hit by a Hilichurl's rock, and then you'd have this special animation where you have to fall all the way down, and then have the special animation where you have to get back up again, but during this whole time, you're actually still vulnerable, meaning you can get chain attacked by enemies that can literally combo you to death before you're even able to act out of the much longer fall animation. Oh, and did I mention that your floating meter does not stop when you get hit? So you can get hit by, let's say, a Hydra Mushroom that shoots a few water bullets at you from off screen, only to get hit by every single one of them, and maybe you'll survive, and if you do, you'll get back up and want to try to take revenge on that watery fungus, only to realize that your floating meter just ran out. Wanderer's lack of resistance to interruption basically means you have to play him with a shield, and Zhongli is really your only good choice, as the 4-star characters like Toma, Layla, Diona, and the like run into uptime issues with Wanderer, and like we said before in the damage section, his damage is good, but it's not amazing unless it's really hyper invested, so Wanderer usually isn't able to make up for the damage from an offensive support if you bring a shield character instead. And all of this would be completely fine if floating gave Wanderer an advantage when it came to dodging attacks, except that it is actually easier for Wanderer to get hit in the air than it is for other characters to get hit while on the ground. Wanderer's hurtbox is deceptively large and it extends well below his feet. This means that Wanderer is effectively the biggest target in the game, as enemies can hit all the way up to the top of his head and well below his feet, only having about a Klee's height of clearance above the ground. This is really unfortunate because it causes Wanderer to be hit by a lot more attacks than it appears he should. But when Wanderer is floating, he is at minimum 1 Layla height above the ground, and yet he can still be hit by attacks that are not as tall as Layla. And this is an example of the visual misrepresentation that plagues Wanderer's kit. We expect that while he's flying, anything below his feet will not affect him. But even though we see that he has plenty of clearance, he can still be hit by attacks that don't appear to be anywhere near him. You would think that the way he zips around in trailers and showcases, and how he's shown floating effortlessly above enemies, he could easily avoid attacks. But we'll talk about this in the next section, as his movement is also a lot worse than it seems. Wanderer's movement is actually a lot slower and more restrictive than it looks in trailers and videos. Ascending while floating can make you avoid enemy attacks a little bit more easily, except that it not only burns your floating meter very fast, but you can also just be unable to hit enemies because Wanderer's auto-targeting can be absolute garbage. His horizontal movement with dashing does feel good, but unless you have a charge of Descent from his Ascension 4 passive talent, dashing also burns his floating meter really fast. Unfortunately, his passive talent for a free dash procs randomly at a 16% chance, so it's actually pretty unreliable, and when you really need it, there is a chance that you would never get it. In practice though, I do see this proccing a lot more than I expect, but I also have C1 and use the 4-piece Desert Pavilion Chronicle, so I'm attacking a lot faster than a typical Wanderer, meaning that I get a lot more chances to trigger this talent than most people would. These issues around how he actually plays versus how he looks, his larger hurt box, and how he can easily be combo food for enemies is further worsened by his base stats. Wanderer has really low health and defense, and since he also has no interruption resistance with longer than normal stagger animations, surprisingly limited movement despite appearing very agile and fast, and is prone to being comboed by enemies after just one hit, he can die really fast. So Wanderer has a lot of issues outside of his emotional and mommy issues, but all these gameplay issues really just boil down to one major issue and everything seems to stem from there. The core issue that plagues Wanderer that I have been very disappointed with is that Hoyo has used Wanderer's visuals to scam you. Everything from the height of his float to the distance his attacks can travel to how big his hurt box is while floating is a lie. This is because the visual information Hoyo chooses to convey with Wanderer and what he is actually programmed to do are totally out of sync. When we see an attack go very far into the distance, we expect that attack to be active all the way until the end, except this is not how it actually works out with Wanderer, because even if his attacks can visually reach a very far distance away, he will never connect those attacks because his auto-targeting is horrendous, and he'll just attack in the opposite direction of where you target. When we see an attack go under Wanderer's feet, we expect this attack to miss, and yet oftentimes it still hits him. And while I don't want to keep rehashing other reasons why Wanderer is a letdown, this information illustrates what I talked about earlier. Wanderer's aesthetics are great, but his gameplay and mechanics do not coincide with his visuals, and that causes a lot of problems. I can imagine Hoyo spent so much time working on the aesthetics of Wanderer, aka the visuals, the sound effects, the feeling of his attacks, and so forth, that they just completely ignored some of the more important gameplay aspects of how he functions, like just how easily grounded enemies can still hit you while flying. And either one of two things happened. One, they rushed development time on his mechanics and they couldn't change all the problems with enemy attacks, his hurt box, visual cues, and so forth. Or two, they knew about these problems and either A, left them in spite of that fact, or B, planned them so you would feel pressured to wish for a character like Zhongli just so you don't have to get juggled by enemies like a circus clown's bowling pins.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Look, not every character in the game needs to be the best, and I'm glad that Genshin is not a game where every new character just power creeps every old character. But Wanderer is a special case because all of his visual indicators fall short of his actual capabilities. This very poor visual communication wouldn't be a problem if Hoyo had a tooltip that gave us numerical values for his attack range, initial float height and ascension height, dash distance, and so forth. But since we don't have any of those tooltips or numerical values, we have to make some weird measurements. Like how his initial float height is a little higher than one Layla in height, except that it's actually not, because his hurtbox extends below his feet, so his effective float hurtbox is more like one Klee height above the ground. And to my knowledge, this is the first time a character's visual information has been so mismatched with their actual gameplay. Which means that if you've never played Wanderer, you wouldn't expect these problems because other characters function mechanically just as they do visually on screen. And at the end of the day, if you still want to wish for Wanderer, that is totally cool. He is a really fun character when everything goes right, and I personally love using him in the overworld. And I also think that the average player may not notice these problems and just have fun floating around throwing wind blades. But if you find that he has a lot more limitations than you expected, and things that look like they should work just don't, remember, it's not your eyes that are lying to you. That's how Wanderer was made.